What's up YouTube? Welcome to another episode of Scales 13. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you my Emerald Swift care guide. Alright guys, so to dive right in, we're going to start with the enclosure setup. So the standard for a pair of Emerald Swifts, the minimum cage requirement is going to be a 36 by 18 by 18 enclosure. You can use an Exoterra, you can use a PVC enclosure, you can even use a wooden enclosure. Doesn't matter. The main thing that you want out of this enclosure is to make sure that it has enough space for these animals to be able to get away from each other and have enough space between the male and the female. Because one thing that I've noticed from keeping the pair that I have is sometimes the female will start to pick on the male and you'll have to separate the two. So it is also good to have a second enclosure available in case you want to separate them for a short amount of time until the animals are getting along again, so to speak. You want to make sure they can get away from each other and they can hide from each other. These animals are an arboreal species that come from Central America, so you want to make sure there's plenty of branches, plenty of vines within the enclosure. You want to make sure that these animals are able to climb and get that good exercise. You want to keep in mind these animals are from the cloud forest of Costa Rica, right? And all over Central America. So these animals need a high amount of humidity. So when you're picking a substrate for your Emerald Swifts, you want to pick something that can hold that humidity and of course without molding. So what you want to use is maybe a bark, topsoil, coconut coir, just to name a few. You want something that they can also dig into, because I have witnessed my Emerald Swifts making burrows from time to time, and after doing some research I actually found out that it actually is part of their normal behavior to make burrows in the dirt. So what I would actually pick over the bark substrates is actually more of a soil or a coconut based substrate. And if you're going to use a coconut coir based substrate, make sure you pick out all the little strings from the coconut fibers in there, so that way the only thing you're left with is the little round pieces. Now the reason I'm saying that is because I noticed them chasing crickets, and there was quite a few times where I saw them actually try to snatch a cricket off the surface of the ground, and they actually got some of those coconut fibers stuck in their mouth, and they've even mistaken some of those coconut fibers for crickets. I guess because the coconut fibers look like their antenna or something similar, and the animals mistake that for food. So make sure if you're going to use coconut fiber, make sure you run through it and you get all those long fibers out of it. So what I would suggest actually out of all the substrates is to just use a soil-based substrate just to keep it safe. Now if you're using a soil-based substrate, that's actually great for growing plants. If you're ever thinking about getting into a bioactive enclosure setup for your reptiles, and you're thinking about doing that for your Emerald Swift, this is a great species to have for that, because number one, the animals are small, so they're not going to trample and destroy your plants like many other species will. They're insectivores, so they're not really going to gnaw and chew on any plants that you plant in there. So your plants will survive quite well. Also, they will benefit from the added humidity that is sustained within the enclosure from adding those plants. So what I did, I planted grass in the substrate of the enclosure, so that way these animals would have some nice ground cover over that dirt. Another thing, speaking about humidity with these animals, so in the cloud forest of Costa Rica, where you'll find these animals can actually live in areas where there can be over 100 feet of rainfall a year. And since there's cloud forest there, that means that there's a very high amount of humidity there. So spraying is a must for this animal. Personally, I would actually suggest not using one of those little tiny hand sprayers. If you're going to spray manually, I would actually use a large pressurized sprayer to spray down the enclosure, just to make it easier and less work, less daunting for the keeper, and to make sure that you're efficiently spraying down and adding moisture to the enclosure. Fun fact that I actually noticed about these creatures that actually ties into keeping some other species like chameleons. These animals actually don't drink from a bowl of water. I've never seen an Emerald Swift drink from a bowl of water, at least in my experience. However, I have seen them not only drink the droplets off of the walls when I spray down the enclosure, but they'll actually drink water off of the leaf litter on the ground in my enclosure, which is pretty awesome. You would never think that the leaves that you're putting down in your animal's enclosure would actually be used as makeshift water bowls, and that's pretty cool. And it actually makes you wonder whether or not that's one of their main sources of water that they would actually find in the wild. Now let's get into the diet of the Emerald Swifts. These guys are insectivores, and they will eat darn near anything that you give them. And you can actually coax these animals into coming to you for food after they've repeatedly seen you feed them time and again. Whether you come in with a bag of crickets or you have some small dubia brood that you want to feed these animals will actually sit on the closest perch to the front of the enclosure waiting for you to feed them, which is actually really cool. These animals are not seen as a very interactive species, so just seeing that small reaction out of them where you can actually interact with the species is actually pretty cool. But you can feed these guys anything from fruit flies to small crickets, pinhead crickets, medium-sized crickets. You can feed them mealworms. Just make sure that whatever you feed these animals, make sure that the insects are eating a healthy diet of fruits and veggies. And if you want to, you can also add a little bit of a multivitamin in there, here and there, just to make sure that these animals are getting the proper nutrition required. And don't forget to dust the insects that you're feeding these animals at least twice a month to make sure that they're getting a sufficient amount of calcium. So speaking of calcium, these animals need a sufficient amount of vitamin D3 to make sure that they stay healthy. I've read on plenty of forums and I've seen plenty of information that this species crashes and burns without proper UVB. I would actually set up a proper T5 UVB fixture for the animal to make sure it can produce its own vitamin D3 within its body, so that way the animal can stay nice and healthy and that there's no signs of metabolic bone disease. So these animals actually don't like to be too warm. They actually like some pretty mild temperatures within the enclosure. These animals like a thermal gradient of around the low to mid 70s to around the mid 80s in the enclosure. And these animals actually like their basking spot to be anywhere from the mid 80s to about 90 degrees for the surface of their basking spot. The basking spot, of course, doesn't have to be too large, but you want to make sure that you're using a bulb and a fixture where the animals are efficiently warming up their bodies, where there's no cold spots. You want to make sure that the animal can actually completely warm its body all at once, so that way it's not sitting under the basking spot all day long, to make sure you can prevent the animal from burning itself. And one other thing I'd like to add, if you're keeping a pair of emerald swifts in an enclosure together, keep in mind there's always the chance that the female might have babies. And you might not notice it in the beginning, because even though if a female gets pregnant, you will see that her stomach will start to swell up because she's carrying the babies. You won't be able to find any eggs in the enclosure. See, because this species is actually a live bearer. They produce live young, and a female can produce on average usually around like 4 young at a time. So one day you might actually just go in your enclosure and open up the door and say, uh-oh, wow, where'd all these little baby swifts come from? And keep in mind, if you do have any baby swifts in your enclosure, congratulations. What you actually want to do is you want to remove those babies from the enclosure, because the emerald swifts will pick on these little babies and possibly eat them, thinking that they're an insect or just any type of prey that they would find in the wild. Alright guys, so I hope you like this Emerald Swift care guide. I actually had a lot of fun making it, because even though this species is one of the most popular ones you'll find in the hobby, they're a lot of fun to keep, and I actually enjoy keeping and interacting with this species a lot. And anyway guys, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like my content, and I'll see you next time. Peace.